There have been various versions of the Frankenstein story brought to film. Some are exquisite, others pure trash. But now we get a new vision and interpretation from Maggie Gyllenhaal with The Bride. This certainly is not going to be for everybody, but is it as good or maybe bad as you think? A lonely Frankenstein travels to 1930s Chicago to ask a groundbreaking scientist to create a companion for him. The two revive a murdered young woman, and the bride is born. So to set the stage, this takes place in a world where Frankenstein exists. He's not just some literary character. Through some supernatural creativity, we're provided with narration from Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, who is now dead, but also wants to tell the story that she wasn't allowed to, which is a love story of sorts. Jessie Buckley plays Shelley, creepily kept in some deep shadows and presented in black and white. Now, she finds a suitable young woman that she wants to possess, Ida, who's also played by Buckley. Ida's a free-spirited, strong woman in 1930s Chicago, and Buckley gets to show off some wonderful talent for swapping characters and accents in the blink of an eye, many times doing it mid-sentence. As Shelley struggles to overtake Ida, the dialogue moves from Ida's raspy East Coast accent line delivery that might make a sailor blush immediately into the posh British accent of Shelley, rife with intelligence and a massive vocabulary, stemming off word associations and synonyms before flawlessly returning to Ida's vocal tenor. Now, this was impressive to watch, especially as Buckley rattles off the words in rapid-fire succession. She absolutely captivates in this role. Now, there's an innocence to a portion of the character, one who can't fully remember everything of her life, creating a potential vulnerability that Buckley easily showcases. But because the bride is still a strong and formidable character, Buckley also contains this ferocity in her eyes, demonstrating the strength and resolve of someone not to be messed with. Christian Bale portrays Frankenstein's monster, or for this film, just Frankenstein, because he doesn't have any other name. And keeping in line with the rest of the reimagining for this story, Frank is a sensitive soul. He's full of longing for companionship. Not necessarily sex, but just the presence and touch of another, something that he's never experienced. Once he convinces his mad scientist of sorts, played wonderfully by Annette Bening, she's not mad in the slightest, just brilliant and daring. But they reinvigorate the corpse of Ida, who met a tragic end, and were then given the wild ride the rest of the story takes us on. Now, it's taken me a full day to process how I felt about the film. I watched it last night, but my gut was saying that I liked it, but that it was also messy, and maybe the negatives were going to outweigh the positives. Even though a lot of my sentiments around the story and the presentation still remain, I do have some better words to describe the thoughts, which also then grew my appreciation for the film by sitting with it. This is a film of punk rock women's empowerment. It's loud, flashy, not always fully polished, but just like the title character, they're both strong, opinionated, and ready to cause a ruckus for the message. And that, in turn, inspires others to then do the same. Now, I don't want anyone, especially any toxic male bros who may be watching this, to hear women's empowerment and get their panties in a ruffle that it's not all about the dudes. This is a very pro-women film, but it doesn't mean it's anti-men. In fact, outside of a few characters, the narrative doesn't paint men as evil or oppressive, and that's especially true where Frankenstein's involved. Frankenstein is the bride's companion for self-empowerment. He doesn't force anything on her, instead looks out for her and then supports her as she stands up for herself. There's this repeated line throughout the movie, "I'd prefer not to." It sounds dismissive or trite at first, but then it becomes the anthem and rallying cry for a group who traditionally didn't have a say in actions or behaviors or even treatment. Frankenstein gives small nods and winks to the bride when she continues to reinforce, "I'd prefer not to," showcasing his quiet support that only she sees. And it's not giving her the approval from a man. Instead, it's just confirming that she is in charge of what she wants. And when she's unable to stand up for herself, only then does he step in to protect. He doesn't insert himself into situations that make the bride an incapable character, but instead provides assistance only when it's needed and called for. Gyllenhaal's husband, Peter Sarsgaard, plays a detective working the case to find Frankenstein and the bride after a bout of self-defense on their part goes kind of vicious. Now, his character is a dual and confused persona. On one side, he showcases a very supportive mindset and view of women, illustrated by his advocating for Penelope Cruz's character to be made a detective. This is all in a time when women were relegated to secretary pools, not investigations. But at the same time, Sarsgaard works actively against other women, leading to some devastating harm. Now, he's not painted to be impish or admirable, just a mixture of the two. The portrayal is enveloping and somewhat mysterious, creating this character who is soft-spoken but also haunted. And the visuals throughout the film, they're frenetic, full of fever dream chaos mixed with some moments of lucidity. A few times we're treated to some dance numbers too, and while these sound out of place in a story like this, which they also kind of are, they also reinforce that punk aesthetic, not conforming to the standard presentation or of any particular genre. There's one dance number in particular that is spellbinding. It becomes sort of a flash mob performance, where the camera slices through the crowd to create exciting movement and energy. Plus, during this, there is a small nod to the classic comedy Young Frankenstein, which I just loved its tiny inclusion. It's also hard to ignore the Bonnie and Clyde influence as the duo race through the countrysides, moving from area to area, typically leaving some sort of violence in their wake. That's not the only piece of inspiration the Bride takes from Bonnie and Clyde. Here, they're not thieves or really even criminals, just all of their actions are born out of the unjust treatment one or both of them receive, which then leads to some decisive violence. And because they acted in self-defense, they're doggedly chased by the police. The why they did it kind of gets lost in favor of the vehement chase, spurred on by those afraid of different. Now, at the start, I had said that this was kind of a messy film, and a lot of that is because of the frenetic skipping that the story does as it moves from scene to scene. There aren't a lot of fluid transitions. Instead, we're thrust into a different location with the characters as they then flee, fight, or perhaps fornicate before the scene changes and a new interaction comes about. And this makes the progression choppy and a little haphazard, even though by the end of the movie, a full arc has been presented. There's also a storyline in this. In one aspect, it is completely unnecessary, only serving as the initial MacGuffin to make Ida into the bride. There's this organized crime angle to the story that barely gets any development. It's frankly pretty uninteresting too, especially because our monstrous duo is already the subject of pursuit and violence. But if we look at it from a different angle, and maybe I am totally reaching here, but if we see the mob boss as sort of a Harvey Weinstein character, someone with power and influence who uses and abuses women and then silences them to protect his empire, then the organized crime fits in well, especially in context with all of the women's empowerment. And from that angle, there's a very satisfying conclusion to the storyline. Now, strangely, for all the energy and bedlam the story embraces, I felt the time during the 126 minutes. Portions began to drag, losing some of the momentum of previous scenes, which I think is most likely just a direct result of the choppiness of the storytelling. Now, I wasn't bored, but I did become restless, not knowing where the story was trying to take us and then wondering when it would arrive. Now, thankfully, the desire to check my watch did subside as the story solidified its final trajectory and then led us towards the conclusion. So overall, despite this having an inconsistent flow, leading to an uneven presentation and a dragging pace in spots, The Bride managed to captivate through the boldness of the storytelling and the brilliant performance of Jessie Buckley. She's quickly becoming one of my favorite actors, if not the favorite. She morphs and shapeshifts personalities and mannerisms, creating vibrant and deep characters that suck you in and refuse to let your attention break. In The Bride, she continues to astound, embracing complexity and ferocity while also demonstrating a powerful longing. Christian Bale is also terrific, here playing a more supportive role, never overshadowing Buckley while still maintaining a prominent presence. The messaging is in your face and maybe too on the nose for some, but the boldness of the story and the unflinching manner in which it's delivered is fresh and appreciated. This isn't the typical love story, but despite the messiness of some of the offerings, the story becomes something hauntingly powerful. There's sex, nudity, ton of profanity, and then a bunch of violence, including sexual assault. I give The Bride 4.5 out of 5 couches. Yeah, I mean, it may be a bit jumbled, but it has just invaded my brain and then it refuses to leave. And I'm looking forward to watch this again and again just to see what else I can glean from it. All right, so what's something surprisingly great that you have seen lately? I would love to hear about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.